Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to dive into some really, really interesting stuff about the Ukraine conflict and all the things going on in the world.
It is absolutely fascinating right now.
I know. And, you know, this is the kind of stuff where I look at the source material that we've got, and I just think, wow, there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into it.
Okay.
And one of the things that really stood out to me in this collection of articles and things was this whole idea of a potential peace plan.
Oh, yeah. This is really captivating right now.
I know. I'm just going to say right off the bat, I find this whole thing incredibly hard to believe. But let's talk about it anyway, because it's definitely out there and people are talking about it. So, so there's this document, right? And it lays out this timeline for peace.
Right.
And this is like early February was when they were supposed to have initial talks.
Yeah, they were going to start talking supposedly in early February and then move to a meeting between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky in mid-March. That's right, a three-way meeting.
And then
an Easter truce, and then by May 9th, they were going to have a peace declaration.
I mean, come on. Does this sound like something that could ever actually happen?
Well, it's certainly ambitious.
Ambitious is putting it lightly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a Hollywood script.
Yeah.
But, you know, what's interesting is what this plan actually proposes. So let's dive into the details.
All right. So the plan proposes Ukrainian neutrality.
Okay. So that basically means no NATO membership.
Right.
Which, you know, is kind of a non-starter for a lot of people.
Yeah, a lot of people are going to have problems with that.
And then there's this whole thing about the EU leading reconstruction efforts.
Right. So massive influx of funds to rebuild Ukraine.
Which, you know, I mean, on the surface sounds good. But where's all that money going to come from?
Exactly.
And who's going to oversee it? And how do we even ensure that it actually reaches the people who need it most?
Right.
It's all very vague.
And this is interesting. There's no mention of reducing the Ukrainian armed forces. And it explicitly states continued U.S. military support.
Okay, so they get to keep their army. They get to keep getting weapons from the U.S., but they have to be neutral.
Yeah.
This is getting weirder and weirder.
And then to top it all off, the document suggests a gradual lifting of sanctions on Russia.
So essentially, Russia gets a slap on the wrist, and everybody goes back to business as usual.
Well, it's presented as a way to encourage cooperation and build trust.
Oh, come on. Trust is the last word I would use to describe this whole situation.
Yeah, you're not wrong about that.
So, okay, we had this plan on paper, but what are people actually saying about it?
Well, skepticism abounds.
That's putting it mildly.
I bet. I mean, you've got some in Russia already comparing it to the Minsk agreements, calling it Minsk III.
Oh, so basically doomed to fail.
Well, the Minsk agreements didn't exactly inspire a lot of confidence.
No, they did not.
And then there's the argument that Russia might not even be interested in negotiating at this point.
Which makes sense if you think they're winning.
Right. And from their perspective, they might be thinking, why negotiate when we're already in a strong position?
Yeah, I can see their logic there.
Yeah.
Although, you know, whether or not they're actually winning is debatable.
Of course.
And what are the Ukrainians?
Well, on the Ukrainian side, there's a lot of concern about the feasibility of neutrality.
Right, because even if they agree to stay out of NATO, Russia's still right there on their doorstep.
Exactly. And that threat isn't going away anytime soon.
So even if they sign a piece of paper saying they're neutral, can they really ever feel secure?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It's a huge question. And it seems like the biggest obstacle here is trust.
Absolutely. I mean, you can have the most beautifully written peace plan in the world.
Right.
But if the parties involved don't trust each other,
it's meaningless.
Exactly. It's all just words on paper.
Yeah. So it seems like trust, or rather the lack thereof, is the biggest hurdle here. But even if both sides were to somehow magically come to the table and actually agree on something, there's another wrinkle in all of this, the question of who can actually sign this agreement.
Oh, yeah. This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
So Zelensky issued a decree back in 2022 that prohibits anyone except himself from negotiating with Putin.
Okay, makes sense. He's the president. He's the one in charge.
Right, but here's the catch. Putin claims Zelensky lost his legitimacy when his presidential term ended.
So in Putin's mind, Zelensky's not even the president anymore.
Exactly. And he's saying that makes the decree null and void.
Wow. So it's a legal and political chess game.
Absolutely. And Putin even suggested that the Speaker of the Ukrainian parliament could be a potential signatory.
Oh, so he's got his own candidate picked out already.
It seems that way.
So on one hand, you have Zelensky saying, nobody but me can negotiate with Putin. And on the other hand, you have Putin saying, Zelensky, you can't negotiate at all.
And that he doesn't even have the authority to say who can.
So we're this bizarre situation where one side is saying the other can't negotiate. The other side is saying the first side doesn't even have the right to say that.
It's a classic catch-22 with potentially enormous consequences.
Exactly. And this whole debate about legitimacy is happening against the backdrop of a constantly shifting military situation on the ground.
Right. So let's talk about what's happening on the battlefield, because that's a whole other layer of complexity.
All right, let's dive into those battlefield updates.
Yeah.
What's the latest in terms of, who's gaining ground, who's losing ground? What are we looking at?
Well, recent reports indicate that Russia has captured Velika Novosilka, and they've made some breakthroughs towards Dnipropetrovsk Oblast.
Okay, so it sounds like Russia's on the move.
They're also making progress in areas like Toretsk and Chasiv Yar.
Those names are probably not familiar to a lot of people, but essentially what we're seeing is Russia tightening its grip on the Donbas region.
That's right.
And that's been one of their main objectives from the start.
Absolutely. They've been focused on consolidating their control over that area.
Okay, so Russia's making advances, but is there anywhere where Ukraine is pushing back?
There's renewed activity on the northern front.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Reports are coming in that Russia has captured Dvorichna in Kharkiv Oblast.
And this is significant because...
This move could potentially threaten Kupiansk.
And why is Kupiansk so important?
Well, it's a strategically important city that Ukraine recaptured last year.
Oh, so this is like a back and forth. They take it, we take it back, they take it again.
It's a very fluid situation, and it's really hard to predict what's going to happen next.
It's like we're watching this grim game of tug of war, and the sad reality is that people's lives are at stake.
Absolutely. Every inch of territory gained or lost comes at a terrible cost.
And speaking of cost, there was a deeply disturbing report that emerged from the village of Rusk-Porekne.
Yes. This was a village that was recently recaptured by Ukraine.
Right.
And there are accusations that Ukrainian soldiers killed 22 civilians.
Wow.
It's a very serious accusation that raises questions about potential war crimes.
I mean, if true, that's horrifying.
It is. And it's a reminder that even in the midst of war, there have to be rules. There have to be lines that are not crossed.
Right. We can't just abandon all sense of humanity and morality.
Exactly. But it's also important to remember that we're getting this information in the middle of a conflict.
Right. The fog of war, as they say.
Exactly. And it can be very difficult to verify information, especially when it comes from sources that might have their own agendas.
Which is why it's so important to be cautious about jumping to conclusions.
Absolutely. We need to wait for all the facts to come out before making any judgments.
And in the meantime, we have to acknowledge that there are always going to be multiple perspectives on any given event.
And that's why it's so important to seek out diverse sources of information.
Right, because the truth is usually somewhere in between.
Exactly. And speaking of multiple perspectives, there's actually a contrasting statement from Russia's Human Rights Commissioner Tatyana Moskalkova.
Oh, really? What did she say?
She suggested that not all Ukrainian soldiers are engaging in these kinds of acts.
So she's basically saying that there are good guys and bad guys on both sides.
In a sense, yes, she's acknowledging that there are individuals within the Ukrainian military who are committing atrocities, but she's also saying that we shouldn't paint the entire Ukrainian military with the same brush.
Okay, that's an interesting nuance because, we tend to want to simplify things. We want to see things in black and white.
Right, we want to identify the good guys and the bad guys.
But the reality is always more complicated than that.
Absolutely. And in a conflict like this, it's especially important to remember that there are human beings on all sides.
And those human beings are capable of both great good and great evil.
Exactly. And the fog of war makes it even harder to see clearly.
So this incident in Rusk-Porekne is a chilling reminder of the complexities of war.
And it's just one piece of a larger puzzle of escalating violence.
Because sadly, the violence is not limited to just those kinds of incidents. We're seeing a surge in attacks on both sides.
That's right. And these attacks are targeting not only military positions, but also critical infrastructure and even civilian areas.
Okay, so can you give us some specific examples of these attacks and what impact they're having?
Sure. So on the Russian side, there have been drone and missile strikes on the Druzhba oil pipeline.
And that's a big deal because...
But it's a major artery for Russian oil exports.
So these attacks are disrupting the flow of oil.
Absolutely. And they're also raising concerns about potential environmental damage.
Because oil spills are a nightmare to clean up.
And they can have devastating long-term consequences for the environment.
So not only is this impacting the Russian economy, but it's also potentially damaging the environment.
Right. And these attacks aren't without consequences for Russian civilians either.
Be needed.
There have been reports of injuries and even fatalities from falling debris.
So even if the intended targets are military or industrial.
Civilians are still getting caught in the crossfire.
And what about on the Ukrainian side? How are they responding?
Ukraine is also reporting drone and missile strikes on various regions.
Including
Kiev, the capital Odessa, a major port city, and the northeastern region of Sumy.
So it seems like both sides are really ramping up the attacks.
Yes, and in one particularly disturbing incident, a drone struck a residential building in Sumy.
Residential building.
Yes, and according to a Russian military blogger, the drone was actually brought down by Ukrainian air defenses.
Oh, wow. So it's like their own defenses backfired on them?
In a sense, yes, and it's a tragic illustration of how the fog of war can lead to unintended casualties.
And it just highlights the inherent danger of using these kinds of weapons in populated areas.
Absolutely, because even with the most sophisticated technology, there's always a risk of collateral damage.
And it's a risk that seems to be increasing as this conflict drags on.
And with tensions escalating like this, it's no surprise that both sides are taking steps to consolidate their positions.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in Russia, for example, there's new legislation aimed at closing loopholes for draft dodgers.
So they're cracking down on people trying to avoid military service.
Exactly, and they're making it a lot harder to get out of serving.
How so?
Draft decisions are now valid for a year.
So you can't just dodge the draft and hope it goes away.
Right, and if you don't comply, you could face fines or even imprisonment.
Wow, so they're really serious about this.
They are, and it's a move that's likely to be met with resistance, especially among those who oppose the war.
Because forcing people to fight in a war they don't believe in?
It's never going to end well.
No, it's a recipe for disaster. But it seems like this crackdown on draft dodgers is part of a broader pattern.
Of tightening control within Russia, yes.
Because there's also that controversial proposal from the Belgorod governor.
Right. He wants to ban students who commit offenses against the military or criticize the so-called special military operation.
So basically, if you speak out against the war.
You could be banned from attending state universities and technical schools.
Wow, that's a pretty drastic measure.
It is, and it's a concerning development because it raises questions about freedom of expression.
And the potential for political censorship.
Exactly. And it's not just individuals who are facing increased scrutiny.
What do you mean?
There are also new restrictions on migrant children's school enrollment.
Really, what kind of restrictions?
They now need documents like proof of legal residence, Russian language proficiency, and even fingerprinting.
It sounds like they're making it a lot harder for migrant children to get an education.
Yes, and it seems to be part of a broader trend of increased scrutiny and control over various aspects of Russian society.
It's a lot to take in, and we've only just scratched the surface of all the things that are happening right now.
It's true, and we haven't even touched on the international implications of this conflict.
Well, I guess that's a good place to leave it for now.
Right.
We'll take a break and come back to dive into the global ripple effects of this conflict. And believe me, it's a tangled web.
It is, and it's only getting more tangled.
So stay with us.
Welcome back.
So we've zoomed in on the situation in Ukraine itself. But now I want to zoom out a bit and talk about the international implications of this whole mess.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how this conflict is playing out on a global stage.
Because it's not just about Ukraine and Russia anymore.
Right. It's become a proxy war in many ways, with different countries and organizations taking sides and trying to influence the outcome.
And the reactions from world leaders and international organizations have been really interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, some of the statements and actions we've seen are pretty remarkable.
Okay, so spill the tea. What are some of the most notable things you've come across?
Well, one that really caught my eye was Tucker Carlson's claim that the Biden administration tried to assassinate Putin.
What?
Yeah, he went there.
Wow, that's a bold accusation.
It is, and it's important to note that he hasn't provided any evidence to support this claim.
And what's been the response from the Kremlin?
Actually, their response has been relatively measured, which is kind of interesting.
I mean, I guess if you're going to accuse someone of trying to kill you, you probably want to have some pretty solid proof.
Right. And the fact that the Kremlin hasn't gone on a full-blown propaganda blitz about this suggests that they might not be taking it all that seriously.
Maybe they're just brushing it off as another crazy conspiracy theory.
Could be, but it's still significant because it shows how this conflict is being used to fuel all sorts of narratives and propaganda.
It's like a giant echo chamber with everyone shouting their own version of the truth.
And it's getting harder and harder to sift through all the noise and figure out what's actually going on.
So Carlson's claim is definitely out there, but Are there any more concrete accusations or actions being taken by the international community?
Oh, absolutely.
Like what?
Well, on the other side of the spectrum, NATO has accused Russia of planning to assassinate the head of Rheinmetall.
Rheinmetall, who are they?
They're a German defense company.
Oh, so they're involved in producing weapons and military equipment.
Exactly. And NATO's saying that Russia was trying to take out one of their key players.
Wow. That's pretty serious.
It is, and it's part of a broader pattern of accusations that NATO has been making against Russia.
Such as?
They've also accused Russia of being behind various acts of sabotage in Europe.
Oh, wow. So it's like a shadow war going on alongside the actual war in Ukraine.
Yeah, in a way it is. And it's creating a lot of tension and mistrust between Russia and the West.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess where each side is trying to anticipate the other's next move.
And the stakes are incredibly high because any misstep could lead to a major escalation.
And speaking of strategic moves, the European Union has just extended sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, for another 6 months.
Wow, so they're really doubling down on their stance.
They are, and these sanctions are specifically designed to target Russia's economy.
How so?
Well, they're going after banks, ships involved in oil transport and aluminum exports.
So they're trying to hit Russia where it hurts the most.
Exactly, and it's a clear signal that the EU is not backing down from its support for Ukraine.
Okay, so we've got accusations of assassination attempts, we've got economic sanctions. This is getting pretty heavy.
It is, but there's also this kind of quirky element to it all.
Oh, really? What do you mean?
Well, there's been this proposal to ban the export of PlayStation and Xbox consoles to Russia.
What? Seriously?
Yeah, and the reasoning behind it is that the chips in these consoles are allegedly being used in drones.
Wait, are you telling me that they're worried about PlayStations being turned into weapons?
It sounds kind of crazy, but that's the argument.
I mean, I know technology can be used for all sorts of unexpected purposes,
Right.
but this seems like a bit of a stretch.
It does, and to be honest, it probably wouldn't have much of an impact anyway.
Why not?
Because both Sony and Microsoft officially left the Russian market back in 2022.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So it's kind of like closing the barn door after the horse is bolted.
Exactly. It's more of a symbolic gesture than anything else.
But it does highlight the lengths that some are willing to go to in order to isolate Russia.
And it shows how interconnected the world is these days.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought that a video game console could become a pawn in a geopolitical conflict?
It's a strange world we live in.
So we've got serious economic measures, and then we've got these weird symbolic bans. It's all very strange, but I guess that's just the nature of this conflict.
It's unpredictable, and it's constantly evolving.
And it's having ripple effects all over the globe.
Absolutely. And speaking of ripple effects, let's talk about what's happening in Serbia.
Serbia? Okay.
Mhm.
Why is Serbia in the news?
Well, their prime minister, Milo Vucevic, just resigned.
Oh, wow. What happened?
He resigned after months of student protests.
Student protests. What were they protesting about?
It all started with a tragic roof collapse at a renovated train station in Novi Sad.
Oh, that's terrible.
It was, and it sparked a wave of anger and frustration among the students.
Because they felt like it could have been prevented.
Exactly. They were accusing the government of corruption and negligence.
And they were demanding accountability.
Absolutely. They wanted those responsible to be held accountable.
So it started with this specific incident, but then it grew into something bigger.
It did. It became a broader movement demanding political change.
It's amazing how these seemingly localized incidents can become catalysts for wider social and political upheaval.
It's like a domino effect.
So the students were demanding change, but what was the government's response?
Well, both President Alexander Vucic and Russia have a different take on the situation.
Yeah.
They're accusing the West of being behind the unrest.
Oh, so they're saying it's not a genuine grassroots movement,
Right. They're claiming that the West is trying to orchestrate another color revolution.
like what happened in Ukraine.
Exactly. They're drawing parallels to the Maidan protests.
So they're basically saying that the Walt is trying to destabilize Serbia.
That's their narrative, and it's a narrative that's often used by authoritarian regimes.
To deflect blame and discredit legitimate grievances.
Exactly. It's a way of silencing dissent and holding on to power.
It's a concerning trend for sure, and it's a reminder that we have to be careful about accepting these kinds of narratives at face value.
We need to look at the evidence and consider all sides of the story.
And we need to be wary of those who benefit from spreading these narratives.
Absolutely, because often they're the ones who are most threatened by real change.
So Serbia is a reminder that the struggle for democracy and freedom is ongoing.
And it's a struggle that's playing out in different ways all over the world.
And it's a struggle that we all have a stake in.
Absolutely, because the erosion of democracy in one country can have ripple effects everywhere.
It's like a virus. It can spread and infect even the most seemingly stable societies.
Which is why it's so important to be vigilant and to defend democratic values wherever they're under threat.
Okay, so we've talked about Ukraine, we've talked about Serbia. Now let's move on to a conflict that's been simmering for decades. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Oh, boy. Yeah, this is a tough one.
It is, and the recent developments are particularly tragic.
Yeah, we've seen hostage deaths confirmed.
Oh, no.
Hamas has acknowledged that some of the hostages they were holding have been killed.
I mean, that's just horrific.
It is, and it's a stark reminder of the human cost of this conflict.
And the families of these hostages, I can't even imagine what they're going through.
It's unbearable, and Hamas has pledged to return the bodies.
But I'm sure that's little comfort to those who have lost loved ones.
Of course not, but at least it offers some closure.
So amidst all this tragedy, there have also been some releases, right?
Yes, there have.
Like who has been released?
We've seen Israeli citizens, Americans, French nationals. It's been a mix.
And how are these releases being handled?
Well, there have been reports of chaotic scenes, confusion, disorganization. It's been a bit of a mess.
I imagine it's a very stressful situation for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And there have also been accusations of Hamas staging events for propaganda purposes.
Oh, really? So they're trying to control the narrative.
Yes. And it's understandable that they would want to do that.
Because they want to be seen as the ones in control.
Right. And they want to present themselves as the liberators of the Palestinian people.
So even in the midst of these releases, there's this undercurrent of manipulation and propaganda.
It's a very complex situation, and it's hard to know what to believe sometimes.
Yeah, you have to be really careful about the information you consume.
And you have to be aware of the biases of different sources.
Because everyone has an agenda.
Absolutely. And in a conflict like this, it's especially difficult to separate fact from fiction.
So these hostage releases are a reminder that even seemingly positive developments can be exploited and manipulated.
And it's a reminder that the road to peace is paved with obstacles.
And that there are no easy answers.
But amidst all the chaos and tragedy, there's also hope.
Hope for what?
Hope for a better future. Hope for a world where these kinds of conflicts are a thing of the past.
It's a hope that we have to cling to, even when things seem bleak.
Because without hope, what do we have left?
Okay, so we've talked about Ukraine, we've talked about Serbia, we've talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a lot to process.
It is, and unfortunately, we're not done yet.
Oh, there's more.
There's always more.
Well, let's take a deep breath and dive back into the murky waters of global affairs.
All right, let's do it. Welcome back.
It's amazing to me sometimes to step back and just look at the sheer volume of things happening in the world right now. It's like you can't even keep up.
It really is. And it's not just the quantity, it's the variety. I mean, we've gone from potential peace plans to school discos as a solution for declining birth rates.
It's like a bizarre mix of the serious and the absurd, and it's all interconnected somehow.
Yeah, you start to see these patterns, these threads that connect seemingly unrelated events.
So let's do a quick recap because we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
All right, so we started with Ukraine and that potential peace plan.
Which honestly still sounds like a fever dream to me.
I know, right? But it's out there. People are talking about it, so we had to address it.
And then we talked about the whole question of legitimacy, like who even has the authority to negotiate a peace deal.
And how that legal and political battle is playing out alongside the military conflict.
And then we dove into the battlefield. Updates the territorial gains and losses, the escalating attacks, the civilian casualties.
And we talked about the impact on both sides, the economic consequences, the psychological toll, the erosion of trust.
And we zoomed out to look at the international implications.
The reactions from world leaders, the sanctions, the accusations, the propaganda, the whole geopolitical chess game.
And we touched on some of the other hotspots around the world, like Serbia and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
And we talked about the rise of Chinese AI and the challenges it poses to the existing power dynamics.
And we even talked about school discos.
Yeah, that was a weird one.
It was. But it highlights this broader trend of governments trying to control people's lives, even down to their social interactions.
And it shows how seemingly small things can be connected to much larger issues.
Like declining birth rates, economic anxieties, the erosion of social trust.
It's all connected somehow.
So I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways from all of this?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that the world is becoming increasingly complex and interconnected.
Yeah, it's like a giant spider web. You tug on one thread and the whole thing vibrates.
Exactly. And that makes it even more important to stay informed, to be aware of what's happening, both in our own backyards and around the world.
Because what happens in one place inevitably affects us all.
And it's not enough to just consume information passively. We need to be critical thinkers.
To question our assumptions, to seek out diverse perspectives.
And to be willing to change our minds when presented with new evidence.
Because the truth is often elusive, and it requires effort to uncover it.
And even then, we might never have all the answers.
But that doesn't mean we should stop asking questions.
In fact, asking questions is more important now than ever before.
Because the more we learn, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of our times.
And to make informed decisions about the future we want to create.
So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.